Does the report of a chemical gas attack in a civilian sector of Syria constitute a valid rationale for staging a military offensive against the Syrian government? What does the August 21st incident have in common with other historical triggers for military aggression? Can humanitarian concerns ever justify defiance of the UN Charter in Syria and elsewhere? Do the NATO interventions in Yugoslavia in 1999 and Libya in 2011 constitute success stories which could inform policy around Syria? In the next hour, we'll examine common justifications for war throughout history, including the so-called responsibility to protect doctrine, with three analysts: Richard Saunders of the Coalition Opposed to the Arms Trade, former Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister and University of Winnipeg President Lloyd Axworthy, and geopolitical analyst and award-winning author Mahdi Nazemroaya. On today's program, Justifying War, Yugoslavia to Syria. Bringing you the analysis beyond the media headlines, the Global Research News Hour is on the air. Welcome to the Global Research News Hour for the week of September 26th, 2013. I'm series host and producer Michael Welch. The Global Research News Hour is a special radio collaboration between the Center for Research on Globalization and campus community radio station CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg. We seek to provide listeners with access to analysis of some of the major stories shaping our world today, from thinkers, researchers, and unique political personalities rarely addressed by major media. Our program is available from the Center's website, globalresearch.ca. Our show is also broadcast on the Progressive Radio Network at prn.fm. We'll begin our show with News Notes, a sampling of articles from the Global Research News site. A day before the release of the UN mission report, another carefully documented report by Mother Agnes Mariam de la Croix and the International Support Team for Musalaha in Syria, ISTEAMS, was released with minimal media coverage. Mahdi Darius Nazemroaya, who examined the report, writes, "The ISTEAMS report does not deny that chemical weapons were used or that innocent Syrians have been killed. What the study does is logically point out through its observations that there is empirical evidence that the sample of videos that the U.S. intelligence community has analyzed and nominated as authentic footage has been stage managed. Among a series of important findings, the ISTEAMS report notes that even though the attacks are said to have killed up to 1,400 people, mostly children appear in the videos, and several corpses are shown in different videos said to have been shot in various locations. While this report seriously challenges the assertion that the Syrian government was behind the attacks, it was not covered by the Western mainstream media, towing the imperial line and parroting Washington's claims, which still lack evidence and credibility." That's from the article "The Ghouta Chemical Attacks, U.S.-Backed False Flag, Killing Syrian Children to Justify a Humanitarian Military Intervention" by Julie Levesque and Michel Chossudovsky, published September 25, 2013. Quote, "Libya would now be engulfed in civil war and bloodshed," unquote. No. The war was ending, and Libya is engulfed in bloodshed. In March 2011, the African Union had a plan for peace in Libya, but was prevented by NATO through the creation of a no-fly zone and the initiation of bombing to travel to Libya to discuss it. In April, the African Union was able to discuss its plan with Libyan President Muammar al-Gaddafi, and he expressed his agreement. NATO, which had obtained a UN authorization to protect Libyans alleged to be in danger, but no authorization to continue bombing the country or to overthrow the government, continued bombing the country and overthrowing the government. That's from the article "Top 45 Lies in Obama's Speech at UN" by David Swanson, posted September 25th, originally published in warisacrime.org. When the British Parliament voted down providing cover for Obama's criminal attack on Syria, Parliament created space for Russia's President Putin to resolve the Syrian situation by attaining Syrian President Assad's agreement to join the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and to turn over all Syrian chemical weapons to an international body. The warmonger Obama regime was outraged that Washington's military attack on Syria had been blocked. Washington and the Israeli lobby went into full-scale demonization of President Putin for orchestrating peace instead of war. The Obama regime is trying to block the agreement by insisting on incorporating into the UN resolution an opportunity for attacking Syria if Washington is not convinced that all chemical weapons are turned over. The entire world knows that Washington will again lie through its teeth, assert that all the weapons were not turned over, and use the wedge that Washington is attempting to force into the UN resolution to start another war. That comes from the article, Washington's Tyranny. What is the real agenda of Obama's War on Terror? By Paul Craig Roberts, posted September 24th. Before the UN mission had reported its preliminary findings, Human Rights Watch jumped the gun on 10 September with its own report written by Peter Beckert, the organization's emergencies director. On 11th of September, a day after the Human Rights Watch report was published, the International Support Team for Musalaha in Syria published its unique and important analysis of documentation nominated by U.S. intelligence. Having carefully and thoughtfully analyzed the data, including a number of images also published in the Beckert report, the study discovered not only widespread manipulation of evidence, but in the tradition of BBC reporting in Syria, they also discovered that photographs of victims in Cairo had been described as victims of a chemical attack in Syria. This preliminary study concludes that there has been gross media manipulation and calls for an independent, unbiased international commission to identify the children who were killed and try to find the truth of the case. This writer has not seen any Human Rights Watch document which refers to the ICEDEM's study. That comes from the article, The Syria Chemical Weapons Attack. Human Rights Watch is Manipulating the Facts, by Richard Lightbone, posted September 24th. These are just a few of the featured articles appearing last week on the Global Research website. Regular visitors to the site are encouraged to send monetary contributions by fax, mail, or online. Just go to globalresearch.ca and click Donate on the menu bar. A chemical gas attack against civilian districts in Damascus has provided the main justification in recent weeks for a military offensive against Syria by U.S. and allied forces. Historically, outrages of this nature have been invoked to mobilize support for military action. They're called war pretext incidents. Richard Saunders is the coordinator of the coalition opposed to the arms trade and publisher and researcher with Press for Conversion magazine. He's studied and written extensively about war pretext incidents. Richard Saunders joined us from Ottawa. The whole business about Obama and the red line that's this chemical weapons attack and the way it just hit the media in a very big way. When you first heard about this, what were your thoughts? Was this were you thinking of this in terms of what's been known as a war pretext incident?
Well, yeah, when Obama made his speech back in August of last year, it seemed to me pretty obvious that he was setting up for a future war pretext incident that they could generate. Basically, he said if Syria were to use chemical weapons, then we would seriously think about attacking them, whereas he had been pretending at least not to be really very keen on a military strike against Syria. He then gave his red line speech August 20th of 2012, and it sounded like, okay, they're going to set up they could very well set up an attack and then make it look as if the Syrian government had done it, and then they'd have their the pretext that they needed to go to war. That's not the real reason for them going to war, but they would use that as their reason, as their excuse that they could generate enough public support to rationalize going into war, because you can't really tell people the real reasons for war. If you told them the real reasons, people wouldn't support it, because people are generally not warlike. They don't want to go to war. They don't like to kill people. This is shown by how difficult it is for the military to get people to kill people. They have to go through a lot of training and brainwashing, and similarly, the public doesn't want to go to war. So you need really good excuses to get people to think that the wars are being fought for good reasons, for moral, just, humanitarian reasons, and in order to stop a bigger crime or more violence from happening, or to curb a dictator, or to promote human rights, etc., etc. That's the biggest thing lately, is the whole responsibility to protect doctrine, which is being used now to get support from progressive organizations to endorse wars and regime changes and bombing campaigns that are really being fought for other reasons. I mean, the real reasons for war are more economic, really, and geopolitical.
And that's, I guess, to define our terms, I mean, we're talking about fabricated pretexts, not the real reason.
Yeah, there's different ways you can, the pretexts, sometimes they're totally fabricated. Like, for example, with the Vietnam War, that was completely fabricated. There was a supposed incident in the Gulf of Tonkin that's become quite famous now, the Tonkin incident, which, they said that the Vietnamese had attacked a U.S. ship, and so this was the excuse that Johnson needed to really escalate the war in Vietnam, the Tonkin incident. So that was totally fabricated. There was no attack. Sometimes they'll provoke an attack, like, for example, with the Mexican-American War. That's more like what happened then in 1846. They sent their troops down to what they said was the border, but it was actually in Mexican territory, and they paraded their troops back and forth deliberately in order to provoke the Mexican side to fire at them, even though they were on Mexican territory. So then they said that they had been attacked on American soil by foreign troops, and so that's how they got their, in a nutshell, that's how they got their public support for that one. It was just provoked. And other times, it's not really clear whether it's fabricated or what it is. Like with the Spanish-American War, it looks pretty clear that it was fabricated, but we can't be sure. I don't think there's actually perfectly clear evidence of a smoking gun in that case. That was in 1898. There was a big U.S. warship in the harbor of Havana, and it blew up, and all these U.S. sailors on board were killed, and the ship sank. And they immediately blamed it on the Spanish and said that there had been a mine placed on the ship, and that had caused it. But subsequent research, even by the U.S. military, showed that it was not a mine on the outside of the ship. It blew up from the inside. It could have been an accident. Maybe there was all the munitions were stored right next to the coal bunker, and so maybe that caused it. And then, but there's allegations that it was deliberately done to create that pretext. Well, in any case, the media jumped in. Randolph Hearst, used his newspapers to promote the war against Spain, and they got a lot of colonies out of that very short war. They got Cuba and the Philippines and Puerto Rico and a bunch of other places that they just absorbed into the American empire.
I think with the whole war pretext approach, it seems clear that the major media, the agenda-setting media, are pretty key players in order to make this happen. How closely, do you have any insights into how closely the media is connected with that whole apparatus? Because it almost seems like they're taking their orders from the government.
I don't think it's as simple as just that they're taking orders. You know, they don't have to be given orders. They know. They know what. They agree. They basically want to go to war too. They want to. They're itching for a war, so they're looking for any pretext as well. Not as if they, there's an order that comes down from the president. Okay, we're going to go ahead on this day, and they know what to do. They know, they're itching for the war as much as the government is. I think they're big, huge corporations, and their advertising comes from these huge corporations. As I said earlier, the wars are really fought for the benefit of the huge corporate interests. Whether they're getting a bunch of natural resources out of a country, or whether they're exploiting labor in a country, getting basically slave labor out of factories, or whether they're using a war to get their military bases spread into a country so that they can dominate a region. The corporations know what side of the bread is, which side it's buttered on. So they're quite able to figure out for themselves when they should start banging the drums for war and promoting the war.
Could you talk about some of the? I mean, there have been wars through history that the wider public would seem to sanction, like World War II, for example. Mm-hmm. Are there examples from those sorts of conflicts where the war?
World War II is a very interesting example because in that case the corporations did not want to go to war. The big bankers and the industrialists were actually quite supportive of Hitler, and they had helped to fund Hitler's rise to power, and they were quite happy to see Hitler strong and powerful, and they wanted him to attack the Soviet Union. That was their real enemy, not Hitler. So they were quite happy to stay out of the war and not get involved in the war. But there were other people that wanted the United States to join the war, and so they created this pretext in spite of what the media wanted. So they needed to. Pearl Harbor was definitely. They knew that attack was coming, and they provoked it. They wanted the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor. That's really clear.
That's established and proven. That was.
That's very proven. Yeah, there was Robert Stinnett. If anybody wants to read the best stuff on that, it's Robert Stinnett who wrote Day of Deceit, The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor in 1999. He got access to a lot of previously secret documents, and there was one document by a guy named Arthur McCollum who wrote a secret memo. It's a 5-page memo submitted to the Navy, and it basically outlined a plan, sort of a 10-point plan on, it's an 8-point plan actually, on how to provoke a Japanese attack on the United States. And it says do this, and then do this, and do this, and do this, and do this, so they did all those things, and after they had done the last one, basically Japan attacked. And they knew that Japan was going to attack, and they knew the exact place and when they were going to attack because they had broken the Japanese codes. This is known too. So that's very clearly it was an incident where they provoked the attack.
What about in more recent years? Some of the more compelling examples of these fabricated war pretexts?
Well, let's see. There's so many examples. Maybe I should point out that I did an issue of Press for Conversion, which is the magazine of the Coalition to Oppose Australia, and it's called Going to War, the American Use of War Pretext Incidents. And so people can look up there, and you can see the details there on about 16 different examples of major wars since the Mexican-American War, 1846, going up to 2003. So this thing was published in January of 2003, just before the war in Iraq. So, for example, let's see, I don't know, maybe the 1999 NATO war against Yugoslavia, there was an incident that happened at Racek. So they blamed the Serbian government, the Yugoslav government, of attacking these innocent civilians and killing a bunch of them. And there were photos of them, and this American ambassador went there and they photographed them, etc. So you had these people lying in the ditch and whatnot. But really, what was going on was that these weren't just innocent civilians; they were rebels that had been attacking the police, and then there had been back and forth fighting between the two sides for quite some time, and then they just happened to just pick a certain moment when the Serbian police or military, I can't remember which now, had killed these attackers. So then they used that incident and they blew it really big, and the media grabbed a hold of it. So another thing was the incubator babies in Iraq in 1991. People probably know about that. Hill and Moulton, the big PR firm, helped fabricate that, and they used the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the U.S. to pretend that she was just some random girl who had seen these Iraqi soldiers come in and throw these babies on the floor out of the incubators. Well, that was all fabricated, but it was great for the media, and the media loved it, and the public were just outraged, and it was just totally made up. Another thing that people should look into if they're interested in this is Operation Northwoods. I'm sure you know about that.
Mm-hmm.
That was a secret document that was released, I think it was soon after the JFK movie came out. There was a bunch of documents that were released as a result.
It was James Bamford that brought it forward, wasn't it?
It might have been him, yeah. So what these documents show, they're from 1962, is that the U.S. military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is the heads of all the Army, Navy, military chiefs in the U.S., had commissioned a report. They wanted some research done on how they could get a war with Cuba. They wanted desperately a war with Cuba in '62, and so they asked this character to come up with some ideas, some plans. So he came up with about 20 different ideas on how to provoke a war with Cuba, and a lot of them were fabrications. Like, so they would say, well, what we could do is we could have bombing attacks in Florida, and we would blow up people, and people would be killed, and then we would blame it on the Cubans. Or that we could have a plane, we could make it appear as if the Cubans had shot down a plane carrying passengers, and they had this elaborate scheme on how they could get this plane up there, and it wouldn't be actually have people in it, and how they would get the people. They would be seen to be entering the plane, and there were these sort of spooks, and then they would land somewhere else and then leave the plane, and the plane would go up, and then the U.S. would get a hold of a MiG fighter and dress it up in Cuban colors, and then it would fire and kill and knock down this passenger plane, and then another passenger plane would be nearby and would see it. So this is all a big elaborate plan that they were cooking up, and it's all there in these secret documents that are released. So it's very clear that they do these things. I mean, they admitted doing. I mean, they release this document showing that they do it. So all through history, you can see these amazing things, and the patterns are so obvious that after a while, you just see them and you just go, well, that looks like another pretext incident.
So, going back to the most recent, being the chemical gas attack, I mean, are there just a couple of telltale signals that show, I don't know, Hill and Knowlton's signatures or what have you?
Yeah, sometimes you can see the fingerprints pretty clearly. Well, I'd suggest people go and look at stuff that's been written on the Global Research site. There's a good article that's there today called "The Ghouta Chemical Attacks, U.S.-Backed False Flag?" ? Killing Syrian children to justify humanitarian military intervention. So that's a good article that's just been posted today. One of the things about that I find quite significant is that Turkey arrested some of the Syrian rebels, and they're on trial. They were arrested last May 23rd. The Turkish police arrested these rebels and found that they had sarin gas and they're on trial. They were recently on trial, and their trial and their indictment, they're being found guilty of these crimes. It just coincides with the chemical attacks. So here are Syrian rebels with chemical weapons. Another thing is the UN investigator Carla Del Ponte. She said that this was back in May of 2013. She said there are, quote, strong concrete suspicions, but not yet incontrovertible proof that it was the rebels that had carried out an attack, a chemical attack back then.
The rebels that the U.S. and its partners are supporting.
Yeah. And then there's been reports that the Saudi intelligence agencies have supported the Syrian rebels with chemical weapons. The thing that really makes you have to be suspicious, I think, is that it makes no sense that Syria would use chemical weapons after they've been told quite clearly by the U.S. president that if they do use chemical weapons, then the U.S. will attack, or that it would, it's much more likely that it will attack. That's a red line. Obama on August 20th last year said that a chemical weapons attack by the government would, they would attack. The U.S. would basically attack if the Syrians did that. So why would they do it? They don't want the U.S. to attack. And also, very strange, it's 1 year and a day after his speech that this attack comes. It's almost as if the attack was being done on a day that would make it, that would tie it to that red line. Again, why would the Syrians do it on that day? Another thing is, why would they do it right near where the UN inspectors are? I think that the UN inspectors had just got there, and they were close to it, close to that location. So why would the Syrians do it at that time, right at that very moment? It makes no sense.
Well, Richard Saunders, it's always great having you on the show. I thank you very much for that analysis, and I guess we'll just see how things unravel as the Syrian crisis moves on. Thank you so much.
It's really fascinating to look at these things, and I really would encourage people to dig into to the history of these things, because you see the history repeated enough times with every war, basically, that the U.S. has promoted, then eventually you see the patterns, and you can start to be more skeptical, and you'll be kind of inoculated against being sucked in and being
intellectual self-defense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Richard. Richard Saunders is coordinates the Coalition Opposed to the Arms Trade and is publisher of Press for Conversion magazine.
You're listening to the Global Research News Hour, broadcast on campus community radio station CKUW 95.9 FM and on partner radio stations across Canada. We are also podcast at globalresearch.ca and air Mondays at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on the Progressive Radio Network at prn.fm. Lloyd Axworthy is a former Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister who co-wrote a commentary in the Globe and Mail in August encouraging the Obama administration to conduct a humanitarian intervention in Syria based on what he called the Kosovo model. The Global Research News Hour interviewed Dr. Axworthy at his office at the University of Winnipeg. Lloyd Axworthy, you were a former Foreign Affairs Minister. And you and a colleague, a cabinet colleague, Alan Rock, co-wrote an article in the Globe and Mail on Canada's preferred role in terms of dealing with the crisis in Syria. And you alluded to, I guess, what's called the Kosovo precedent as a means of reconciling the veto, apparently the perennial veto by Russia as an obstacle to action. Do you want to talk about that actual precedent and how it applies here?
Well, I think it really starts when I was in foreign affairs, and the world was changing. The Cold War had come to an end, and what was appearing increasingly were a variety of conflicts that had huge impacts on the life and well-being of civilians. Rwanda being a good case, where a genocide took place. The Balkans, Kosovo, where there was large-scale ethnic cleansing and large-scale murder of Kosovars, Muslims. The Democratic Republic of Congo was going through the same thing, and I think what we were seized by at the time is that there had to be a much better way of protecting people, and part of the problem is that much of the violence against civilians was by their own governments. And when I was Foreign Affairs Minister, established an international commission on intervention and sovereignty to say that simply because you call yourself a sovereign state doesn't give you the right to murder your own people. And that grew into the concept of responsibility to protect, which was brought forward to the United Nations in 2005, adopted by virtually all the world leaders, and its basic maxim is that a president, a general, a foreign minister, whoever is responsible for policies, if they undertake a serious set of atrocities against their own population, the international community has a responsibility to provide protection for those people. It is a recognition that the old sovereign nation state of the 19th century needs to be modified and amended. And Kosovo was the first time that we really put it to the test because, well, the concept has a lot to do with prevention, a lot to do with trying to use diplomacy to get governments who are murdering their people to change their minds, or in some cases, using the International Criminal Court to hold them accountable. Sometimes the real test is, can you use force to bring about some resolution of that kind of conflict situation? And that was adopted by the United Nations in 2005. People forget that. But Kosovo was the real test when, in fact, it was done. It worked. Milosevic eventually ended up going to the International Criminal Tribunal. And so that concept, both Alan and I, Alan was the UN ambassador, I was a foreign minister, we worked together on it, and we felt that what was happening in Syria was a pretty good example of where responsibility to protect should be applied.
Yeah, I know that the concept of responsibility to protect, it's in principle, it's kind of hard to argue against it. But I guess, in fact, I know that a former UN humanitarian coordinator I spoke to some time ago, Hans von Sponek, seemed very complimentary of you for championing that. However, I have also heard a lot of criticism in the sense that in practice you end up intervening in areas or using that R2P concept as a cover for some sort of a geostrategic initiative, saying, well, we got to stop the violence. It's not really applied in a universal way. So
that's not exactly right. The concept is more than a concept. It's actually a protocol, which sets out very clear steps to ensure against an individual country using it as a pretext to intervene. It's got to go through multilateral decision-making. It's a military means that have to be limited. You have to demonstrate evidence about them, what atrocities are taking place. And so there's a whole set of criteria that are applied to R2P, beginning with the fact that it's a last resort. You don't do it without having tested all the other toolkits that are available in diplomacy and sanctions and naming and shaming and all those things. And it has worked in many cases. I mean, it's not, it doesn't work perfectly because nothing in the international world works perfectly. It worked in Libya. It had a very major impact in Kenya to begin with when Kofi Annan intervened, but that wasn't a forceful one. It worked in the East Timor, worked in the Balkans. So it's not, and I don't think in any of those cases, because I was involved in many of them, there was some secret reservoir of oil that we were trying to achieve. It was just that ultimately we need to have a world based on the rule of law and on some sense of justice and equity. And simply because there is this old concept of sovereignty around, that shouldn't get in the way of protecting innocent people from being murdered by their own governments.
I think one example that comes to mind to trying to illustrate the point that's being relayed here is the situation with people in Gaza who have been confronted by attacks from Israel. I know Amnesty International, among other human rights organs, have spoken about or reported on the use of white phosphorus during the Operation Cast Lead in 2008-2009, and we don't seem to see the R2P concept being applied there. Is that a different situation in your view, or why does there appear to be the appearance of a double standard?
Well, as I recall, and I was on the board of Human Rights Watch for several years, those incidents took place before the R2P concept was adopted. So there's an ex post facto feeling. I think it does act as a deterrent, and if there are cases, I mean, I think one of the criteria of measurement is the degree to which there is a large-scale effort to mutilate, murder, or ethnically cleanse people. That's one of the criteria that have to be applied. But the reality is you also have to get political support for it. I mean, it's never, there's no law that can ever be applied if there is a division and fracture as there is now. And that's why one of the reasons both Alan Rock and I made the case that before we really get a chance to have R2P become a broader principle, and by the way, it's a principle that just doesn't have to apply, or a protocol that applies just to cases of extreme violence. It could also apply to problems related to natural disaster or criminal cartels. I mean, whenever a country loses its ability to protect its citizens, it loses its sovereign divine rights. But you have to have political support for it. And the problem is when countries like our own and others don't make it a major platform at the UN and other places, you can't develop the kind of political will that's required to, and it's true in a domestic situation. If most citizens didn't agree that there's laws against murder, then we'd have an awful lot more chaos than we have domestically. But it still means people commit murder, but far less than they would if there wasn't a law and a police to stop them.
For a more critical look at the model of humanitarian intervention envisioned by Dr. Axworthy for Syria and similar countries, we are now joined on the phone by Mahdi Darius Nazamroya. He is a research associate with the Center for Research on Globalization. He's the author of The Globalization of NATO and The War on Libya and the Recolonization of Africa. And as a geopolitical analyst, he specializes in the politics of Central Asia and the Middle East. He contributes to the Strategic Culture Foundation, Moscow, and is a member of the Scientific Committee of Geopolitica in Italy. Welcome to the Global Research News Hour, Mahdi Nazamroya.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so first of all, you had a chance to listen to some of President Dr. Axworthy's comments about the proper approach to Syria and the whole humanitarian intervention model based on the Kosovo model. Do you have any thoughts that come to mind about some of what he had to say?
Well, with all due respect to Mr. Axworthy, the president of the University of Winnipeg has his facts wrong when he states that Libya was a model of success. If he wants to call Kosovo and Libya models of success, he has his facts wrong. Actually, those aren't the only misperceptions he has, to put it politely. He has his facts wrong about Kosovo. When he stated several times there was genocide took place in the province of Kosovo, he is actually contradicting what the United Nations has ruled. United Nations Court has ruled that there was no genocide there. That includes a panel, a tribunal of international judges, one of which was Albanian. They ruled that no genocide took place. NATO has said the same thing, including a Canadian military officer who served as the OSCE's with the Kosovo verification mission. Even the OSCE have said that no genocide took place. So Mr. Axworthy has his facts wrong about that. Now,
what about atrocities?
Well, there was deaths in both Libya and Kosovo, but to say that there was deaths and we need to intervene is not enough. We need to contextualize those deaths. How did they take place? Well, they first took place when weapons shipments were being sent into these places to non-government movements or militias. In the case of Kosovo, it was the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army. And in the case of Libya, it was a group of rebels with various names and affiliations. One of them was the Islamic Fighting Group of Libya, which is affiliated to Al-Qaeda. But before I mention that, I want to point out that in Kosovo, as the United Nations has ruled, there was no genocide, but there were deaths. How did those deaths start? How did the whole situation in Kosovo start? It started when the KLA started targeting Kosovar Albanians, not just Serbs, Kosovar Albanians who worked in the civil service. They meant to do this to drive them out and to create a gap between the Serbs and the Kosovar Albanians, to make it an ethnic issue, Serbs versus Albanians in Kosovo. So that's why the Yugoslav Federal Army intervened into Kosovo. It wasn't because of genocide or ethnic cleansing. Of course, I have to mention that this matter wasn't a bed of roses. There was mistakes, and the Serbian forces there got out of hand in several situations. But they originally went in there to protect Kosovar Albanians, not just Serbs. Okay, so that's the issue of Kosovo. Libya.
It's been depicted as basically just going out and killing all the Kosovars. It's without that context that it was essentially in a protective mode.
Yes, it was in a protective mode, and also was to preserve security in the Albanian-dominated province of Kosovo. But I want to also mention Libya.
You were in Libya in 2011, were you not?
Yes, I was in Libya. I saw R2P firsthand, and before I actually jump into Libya, let me backtrack and say something about Kosovo. More Kosovar Albanians were killed by the NATO bombing than by Serbs, so we should keep that in mind.
And there were also, and what about like other sorts of the infrastructure of the country? It was affected.
Well, they bombed infrastructure in both cases. Now, this is where I want to speak about my first-hand example on Libya on the ground when I was in North Africa. They bombed the hospitals. They bombed residential neighborhoods. They bombed water treatment facilities, food depots, electricity infrastructure, hospitals, universities, schools, residential areas, if I haven't mentioned that. I don't think that's responsibility to protect. That's creating humanitarian disasters. They are creating humanitarian disasters by attacking. I mean, if that's Miss R2P, that's not responsibility to protect. It's actually imperialist war and crimes against humanity.
Could you clarify something for me? I mean, is it your opinion that those, all that infrastructure, the schools and whatnot, were deliberately targeted, or was that just what they call collateral damage?
Well, there was no military sites near them, no soldiers near them, and yes, it was deliberate. In fact, when they bombed the radio station, television stations in Libya, they said it was because of R2P that they killed all those journalists. They said that what they were reporting amounted to crimes. It was basically to have a monopoly over information. So they were deliberately, of course, Tripoli was under siege, and to get I'm going to paraphrase what the Prime Minister of Italy said, the former Prime Minister of Italy during the time of the war. He said that the whole point of this war is to make their lives as miserable as possible, the people of Libya and Tripoli, so they actually do rebel against Gaddafi. That was the whole point. I mean, who sent the weapons in? How did these humanitarian disasters start? They start when the weapons are sent to one of the sides, and that side specifically is the side that's not the legitimate government, and then they start fighting. If Mr. Axworthy really cares about protecting human lives, he should be lobbying for the United States and other countries, including the League of the most anti-democratic league in that region, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates and Jordan, from sending weapons in to these countries. How are we working with these tyrannical, undemocratic countries like Saudi Arabia, where there are no human rights, to help other countries? I mean, there seems to be something very odd with this coupling, Canada, United States, working with countries like Saudi Arabia, that are sending weapons, supporting people that eat other people's hearts, people that are raping it, people that cut the throats of people just because they're Christians or belong to a religious sect that they don't ideologically agree with. I mean, this is the type of people we want to intervene to protect. I mean, if we really care about any humanitarian process in Libya, the first thing we're going to do is stop sending weapons into that country, which is making the situation much, much, much worse.
Well, if I could I'm just going to quote something from the article he wrote in the Globe and Mail with Alan Rock. He's referring to the UN Security Council and the responsibility to protect doctrine, and it says, quote, that the UN Security Council did not intend that urgent humanitarian responses would be hostage to vetoes unreasonably exercised out of self-interest by one or more of the permanent 5 council members. The very purpose of R2P is that we should all protect innocent lives without reference to purely national interests or crass political gamesmanship. And I think in the context he was referring to Russia. But how would you address that sentiment?
Well, I'm going to make something very clear. When he talks about humanitarian action, he means an invasion and a war. That's very clear. He's not asking for, let's send food supplies to Libya. Humanitarian action, replace that word with a war, an attack, or an invasion on Syria. He's saying the Russians, and I have to add the Chinese as well, are vetoing an attack on Syria. We want this attack to be legal. We're going to say we're doing it for the Syrian people. And because they've prevented us from attacking, we need new measures. I mean, R2P if we look at every single case of this R2P doctrine in practice, despite what Mr. Axworthy thinks it can be used for, and despite what many people might think it might be used for, and many of these people have a noble vision for the use of responsibility to protect and are genuinely supporting it with humanitarian concerns. Despite what they say, every case of R2P has been used for negative, nefarious reasons. From Libya to Kosovo, they have been used for negative reasons, and not only that, if we measure them in qualitative and quantitative ways, they were negative. The quality of lives did not become better, the living standards did not go up. Actually, after our so-called humanitarian intervention in Kosovo, it had the highest suicide rates in Europe. Suicide jumped up there because life became so miserable. If you ask Kosovar Albanians what they think about their country, they're going to tell you we own nothing, and this place has essentially become a colony. That is not success. Libya is a country that's broken. It's basically decentralized. You have tribalism now. You have little fiefdoms. The government is not in control of most of the territories of the country. There's armed gangs, lawlessness. People are being killed. There's robbery. A country that had a relatively low rate of crime, much lower than ours in Canada, is now filled with daily crimes. People are being kidnapped. They're being killed in the streets, gunned down. No oil is even being sent. Its economy is in disasters. This is a country with the highest living standards in Africa, one of the highest living standards in Africa. And economic success has been brought down to its knees. Now, if this is a model of success that Mr. Axworthy is talking about, then success in Syria is going to destroy that country and then cause regional instability. Let's see what our intervention in Libya did. Did it not lead to a war in Mali? Did it not lead to instability and fighting in Niger or terrorist events in Algeria? Have weapons in Libya not been smuggled and sent to other parts of the world, including Syria, where they're being used to fight? This is not success. This is actually disastrous. Any more of these successes, and we're going to ignite much bigger problems in the world that won't be contained to specific regions.
I guess I have some curiosity about the invocation or the genesis of the R2P concept. It has been invoked in the past, even in the very distant past, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yes, definitely. I'm very glad you brought this up, Michael. The first people we can see talking about responsibility to protect in contemporary times would be the Nazis. Their responsibility to protect, and what Mr. Axworthy is advocating for is very similar to what the Nazis advocated for when they invaded Czechoslovakia. They said that the Sudetenland's ethnic Germans, who formed a majority in the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, were being mistreated, and because of humanitarian reasons and concern, they intervened there and they annexed it. I mean, so that puts them on the same page, and many people in Europe agreed with this, actually. In Germany, it was very popular, and many people in Europe agreed with the move. But looking in hindsight, we know that the Nazis lied about a lot of things, even though their citizens in a lot of countries that supported them in Europe didn't know these things. The German people didn't know they're on the wrong side of history, and they didn't know they're being led into another world war. Here, too, in North America, specifically our country, Canada, a lot of people don't realize that these people that are advocating for responsibility to protect are pushing us further into wars. Where's the next country where we're going to have our responsibility to protect? I mean, look at a country like Congo in Central Africa. Millions of people have died there. Very few people have said anything about responsibility to protect there. Very few people have said anything about Bahrain. Very few people have said anything about Saudi Arabia. It just happens to be that the countries that are not in our political orbit or clients are the ones where we're invoking responsibility to protect in. Sudan, Syria, Libya. These are the countries. And if we carry on like this, what's to say that the United Nations won't end up like the League of Nations, a failure? We're on that path. With all these unilateral actions, these so-called responsibility to protect. The Japanese did the same thing in China, too. They said that they used very similar excuses, not just humanitarian context, terrorist bombings of railroads, and when we know it was the Japanese who did it themselves. These unilateral actions, which is what the R2P is essentially coming down to, it essentially is unilateral in the sense that a group of countries, a small group of countries that very vocally always call themselves the international community. This small group of countries is basically a few countries in the EU, Canada, the United States, Israel, Japan, Australia, Singapore, a few countries. They're saying that they're the entire international community, but the opinions of countries like Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, China, Armenia, Iran, Sudan, Algeria, Brazil, India, Argentina, Venezuela, Cuba, they don't count. They're not part of the international community. So whenever we hear countries saying the international community, they're appropriating those words to justify nefarious wars.
Mm-hmm. So, do you see that? If basically, to sort of paraphrase, if you're saying that the humanitarian intervention is essentially a propaganda ploy to justify rallying a population into a military conflict for, I guess, imperialist reasons, then do you see much hope that the wider public will see through this? Are we seeing it now with regard to Syria?
Well, if you want to look at the cheerleaders for humanitarian intervention, it's very odd. We have liberals, and I mean not big L liberals. I mean people who consider themselves liberals that support it. Some progressive people, I guess you may call them. And at the same time, you see people like John McCain, Joseph Lieberman, Benjamin Netanyahu, the PNAC, a bunch of neoconservative think tanks, all supporting it as well. There's some sort of alliance between them for these wars. And in regards to Syria, I think people don't buy what they're saying at all. I mean, when people are realizing that for some reason the people that we've been told by the U.S. government that they're fighting the last decade in the global war on terror are the ones they're supporting in Syria. That's why 9% of Americans only support a war. 91 don't. The majority of the world is against it. Even the United Kingdom's Parliament in London, they revolted. There was a parliamentary revolt. They're aware that this war won't be popular, has zero support, and most people are really aware that there's no humanitarian concerns. I mean, John McCain, who was pushing for this war in the United States, has been grilled by his constituents, saying we don't want to go there to help anybody. It's for very bad reasons. If they really want to help anybody, they got to stop sending the arms to these groups that are killing people indiscriminately and destroying Syria's society. If they were real revolutionaries like Che Guevara, they would not attack marketplaces in Libya or the universities or the towns or civilians or churches or blow up mosques. They would be going for political targets. They would be going after the regime, not against innocent civilians. But instead, they're spreading chaos in that country by attacking and weakening it.
Well, Mahdi Nazem Roy, I really want to thank you for those perspectives that you've brought to this very important debate, and hope that we can touch base again soon for more analysis from you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Michael.
Mahdi Nazem Roy is a geopolitical analyst based in Montreal. He is the award-winning author of The Globalization of NATO and the War on Libya and the Recolonization of Africa. He's also a frequent contributor to globalresearch.ca. You've been listening to the Global Research News Hour. You can hear our programs every week on CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg and on partnering radio stations across the country. We are broadcast on the Progressive Radio Network at prn.fm. You can also download each episode from the website globalresearch.ca. To leave feedback on this program, email globalresearchnewshour@gmail.com. Starting the first week of October, the Global Research News Hour will air on CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg, Canada at its new time, Fridays at 1 o'clock p.m. Central Time. I am series host and producer Michael Welch. Join us again next week.